Hey guys, how's it going? Coach Weston here with Good Lift Performance, our first YouTube video. I'm very excited to be starting a YouTube channel because I've always wanted to do deep dive content that was harder to make on Instagram because it's hard to really go into the weeds on Instagram. So I'm very excited to be able to hop on the camera and word vomit all of my ideas onto the interwebs. Hopefully you guys like them. Hope you guys like the content. So I wanted to start off our first YouTube video going over a more big picture idea that I think will help kind of set the tone for how I think about programming overall for athletes ranging from novice to intermediate to advanced. This idea comes a lot from the idea that a lot of beginners want to copy what their idols are doing, what they see the top people in the sport doing. But that's not often how the top people, how they train now, is not often how they trained getting to where they are now. And so I thought about how theoretically you'd want to best train a powerlifter to go from novice to intermediate to advanced, and how the progression of programming would look. And this is an idea that I have kind of kicked around in my head for a while and that I've done with my athletes, but I've never really sat down and really fleshed out what that looks like. And then recently I've completed the Yard Cat mentorship with Brad Couillard and Sean Collins, which was an amazing experience. And they actually reference more or less the same exact idea that I've been kicking around. So it made me really confident in this idea of like, oh, other high level coaches in the space kind of see training the same way I do. And so I wanted to make this video to kind of flesh out this big picture idea of how you might take a athlete from a novice stage to an intermediate stage and then up to an advanced stage. Because I think while they're all pretty similar, there's important differences there about how you should be tackling each one of them. So starting off with a novice. Well, first off, what is a novice lifter? Because you can have lifters who are not necessarily new to exercise or training, right? They might be coming into powerlifting with other experience, like sport experiences, playing sports in high school. Maybe they got into powerlifting in college, or you might have someone who is just brand new to lifting entirely. They might have seen a powerlifting on social media and they thought, "Wow, that's really cool. I want to get into that." So. Depending on what kind of person you're dealing with, this will change where you're gonna kind of drop them into this like progression of periodization. But for the sake of the beginner, we're gonna talk about someone who really has no training experience very much. We are really developing them from the ground up. So what is that going to look like? Well, first, let's identify our goals. What is our goals with these lifters? What is the most important things to develop in a novice athlete? First, I would say the most important thing is to develop good technique with them. Now, what is good technique? That's a whole other video for another day. For now, go check out Steve DeNovi's video on good technique, PR's performance. It's a really good video talking about trying to define what is good technique. I, for the most part, subscribe to that same ideology, so you can kind of just place that here of first we want to develop good fundamental technique. But for powerlifting, more or less that means we are lifting to competition standard on every lift in terms of squat, bench, deadlift. We're on every rep, no matter how many reps in the set, no matter how much weight is on the bar, it needs to be to competition standard and it needs to be efficient and consistent. Now, as a beginner, it's not going to be 100% that, right? We're trying to focus in terms of we're not going to be 100% efficient and consistent, but we want to try to get our athletes to be moving to a competition standard very early on, and then we want to get them within the 80% heuristic. If you're familiar with Mike Teixeira of Reactive Training Systems, he talks a lot about if your technique is within like 80% of efficiency, you're good to start loading it. And so that's kind of the heuristic I use with my athletes when I take on a new lifter. I want to get them within that 80% heuristic, and then I'll focus on loading them up. So the reason we want to focus on that as a new lifter is because that's going to be something you can take with you for the rest of your lifting career. The sooner we get you to lift to the standard and lift with good technique, the better the rest of your progression into intermediate and advanced territory will be. I really dislike the argument that people will who argue against technique will say, well, everyone knows that really strong person with terrible technique that never gets hurt. And I would argue if you look at in the top 10 of USAPL all the athletes who consistently do well and who are up there, none of them have really bad technique. They're all very efficient. And so having efficient technique is a requirement more or less to get to a high level, which is all what we're all trying to do, right? So developing good technique early on and then just continuing to hone that over your lifting career is really, really important. We want to hit that from the ground running. And then our second objective is we want to start building muscle. We need to start adding muscle to our frame. If you look at all the best lifters in the top of their weight class, they're all pretty jacked. They're all very muscular, filling out the weight class. They're not the days of fat powerlifters is dead and gone. You need to be jacked and have lots of muscle on your frame to really fill out that class. And even in the higher weight classes, they're still incredibly muscular human beings. Like look at Jesus Oliveras. Like, yes, he has a lot of body fat on him, but he's also incredibly muscular, probably more muscular than anyone else like in that federation. So we need to have a focus on building muscle. And as a natural athlete, building muscle takes a long time. So you'll notice as we go through this progression, building muscle is almost always a goal that we want. It might not be the primary goal because it's hard. We're not bodybuilders, right? That's not our absolute objective, but building more muscle will help us increase our ceiling of how strong we can get, how much force we can produce. And so always having muscle building in the background, or at least something that we're always working on, is going to be very important. Because if you listen to Bryce Lewis's video on beginner programming, he made a really good point of you can't really ever double down on muscle building. It's something that it always needs to be going because it just takes a long time. You can only synthesize so much muscle so quickly. So it's something that we always want to be tackling. So those are our two primary goals. We want to build good technique, and we want to focus on building muscle from early on. What are things that we don't want to be focusing on? I think this is an important caveat for the novice compared to the intermediate and then the advanced lifter. When we are building out training for the novice, we don't need to be focused on the hyper individualization that is really popular in powerlifting right now. Because as a novice, they're more or less going to respond to anything. And so if you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what they respond to, you're not going to get very good data because they're going to respond to almost anything pretty well. Really figuring out the niche of what they respond to isn't going to become apparent until they're more into the late, intermediate, advanced stages. So we don't need to focus on that, as well as we don't need to have this very rigid structure. As a new athlete, they're going to, especially someone who wants to be, or is newer just to the gym in general, they're going to want to explore and try lots of different things. And so having a loose structure is going to be really useful. Yes, we want to have consistency in training, right? But we don't want to have it be so limited that they feel constrained and that it feels like a job. Like we want this to be fun, right? We want to build enjoyment of training. If you look at like true long-term athletic development models, that's one of the most important things is developing a love of movement and exercise. And so that's what we want to be doing with our novices, and so that's why we don't want to have a super strict structure. And so with that, we really don't need to have a complicated like periodization model here. It's better to have like, all right, here's our training split. Here is kind of the exercises we're going to be focusing on, and then we can rotate out exercises. And we don't need to be hyper specific. So if we want to, we can focus on bench press, but we can also do incline, we can do overhead, we can do dumbbells, we can do dips, right? Like adding a lot of variety in there will allow them to get strong at a lot of different angles, build muscle, and allow them to explore and have fun. Obviously, we still want to try to push the big three, and so that's going to be our focus. But we don't need to be overly focused on that. That's going to be a smaller portion of your total work, and you're going to be doing a lot of other exercises. So any kind of like a recommendation for what kind of training this would look like would be any basic like power builder program. That's why it got really popular, is because it's a good hybrid of we are spending some time getting stronger, but we are also spending a good amount of time focusing on hypertrophy, focusing on movement variety, getting them muscular and moving in lots of different ways so they become a well-rounded lifter. So that's what I would do with a new lifter. And as I said, we don't need like a complicated or super well thought out periodization model yet, because they can literally just add weight to the bar probably every session or every week and make progress. And so we don't really need to get into more of a structure or phasic plan until that stops working. And that's kind of where we start going from a novice into an intermediate, is when we need to start applying more of a structured training, because a more generalized plan no longer works. It no longer is pushing progress. Now we need to start tightening up the restrictions or start being more specific about the variables that we are using. So that's where we would start to go from a novice to an intermediate. So now, if we're in the intermediate stage, what does that training look like? First, let's go over our goals again, like we did with the novice lifter. So our primary goals, obviously we still want to be building muscle. That's going to be more of our secondary goal there. And then our primary goal is to be adding more structure to the training. So here, this is where you would kind of go from that linear progression of just kind of adding like 5 pounds, 10 pounds to the bar, to now, all right, now we're going to go into specific phases of training. Maybe this might be a linear periodization, or maybe more like block periodization, where we have specific blocks dedicated to hypertrophy, and then like strength blocks, and then peaking blocks. Remember, at this time, we still don't know specifically what an athlete does and does not specifically respond to, because they're still pretty new. They're still going to respond to generally everything. But now we're getting to the point where we just need to be more specific with the training. And also, by the time they're getting to this point, they're going to be more committed. The thing with powerlifting is that, yes, it is a very mundane training. It's the same thing a lot of times, just over and over again, right? So for the novice, we don't want to really introduce that too early. But as we start to progress into the intermediate stages, they're going to be more comfortable with that, because they're committing to powerlifting, either to be competitive, or at least as their health and wellness recreation activity. So they're going to be, if they're getting into the intermediate stages, they're probably okay with a little bit more monotony of doing the same things over and over again, and they're wanting to specifically build the squat, bench, and deadlift. And so we need to have those more specific principles applied to them. So we're adding a more specific structure, but we're not specifically looking at, all right, what specific percentages do you respond to, or what rep range, or what this, that, and the other thing, because that isn't 100% apparent yet. They're still going to be responding to generally everything. So the way I would specifically structure this is, we're going to go into I call it like a block periodization. This isn't true block periodization, but this is how I think about it and how I was taught about it in one of my internships. Is we would have a basic hypertrophy block, a strength block, and then a peaking block. And then from there, there's going to always be a primary goal and then a secondary goal of each block. So for our hypertrophy block, we want to specifically focus on hypertrophy. That's going to be our primary goal there. And then our secondary goal needs to be, or what I think is useful, is technique retention, because we don't want to get away from our technique with heavy lifts. Oftentimes I find that when the problem with more of a phasic structure, and why it's gotten less popular in modern powerlifting, is that when you do like a pure hypertrophy phase, though, like you're spending all of your time away from the really intense stuff and doing a lot of low intensity things to use more volume to accumulate more work, and then you lose practice with that heavy weight, and by the time you get back to the heavy weight, you're out of practice. And so it's good to include a small amount of technical work that's at higher intensity. So like, say, a single, a double, a triple, or a set of 4, maybe a set of 5 at a relatively high intensity for your top set, and then you can do the back off works at your 8 reps, 9 reps, 10 reps, or whatever that ends up looking like, right? But we want to retain technique with high intensity as sort of the secondary goal, so that we can transition to the other blocks easier. But we also want our primary goal to be focusing on higher volumes, building muscle. In this phase, we can also not focus our intention so much on how much volume we're doing in the main lifts. We can still have a focus on accessory lift volume and pushing that. Some lifters can't handle like a lot of volume in the competition lifts, so it might be useful to do more accessory volume. Other lifters might be able to handle more volume in the main lifts, and so you might want to push those main lift volumes up a little bit more in that area as well. Especially now that we're out of the intermediate phase, or out of the beginner phase. So In the beginner phase, we're not going to be using a ton of competition volume. Once we get into the intermediate phase, that can start to build up a little bit more. And so that would be the hypertrophy block. Going into the strength block, our primary goal is now developing strength. We want to be working probably more in that 70 to 80% range, maybe up to 85%, working in that kind of sweet spot of like 4s, 5s, and 6. And then having the secondary goal be hypertrophy, because we want to always be focusing on building muscle for the most part. So that would be the strength block. And then going into the peaking block, our primary goal is obviously to get ready for competition. So we're going to be doing more singles, doubles, and triples to prepare to get your skill improved with heavy weights, as well as just developing the nervous system coordination, all that fun stuff. And then our secondary goal will be still strength, because we want, in my opinion, doing a block like a peaking block where it's all singles, doubles, and triples generally tends to be not enough volume to retain a lot of good strength. So oftentimes when I do peaking blocks, I still have like a strength day and then like a high intensity day. So like a day of singles, doubles, and triples. And then on our secondary day, it's going to be like 4s, 5s, and 6s. Because I feel like having that strength, more volume day, even though it's heavier volume than like a hypertrophy block, it's still useful to keep that in there during the peaking block to kind of keep that foundation of volume, maybe just at a lower exertion RPE, and then focus on the primary day of really peaking the intensity there and with the top set and doing your singles, stuff like that. So that's how I would build a intermediate phase of training. And then what you're going to do is basically just run that back and forth. You can just kind of rotate between hypertrophy blocks and strength blocks until you find a meet, and then you can do a peaking block. The reason you don't want to do peaking blocks too much is because you're not really doing good hypertrophy work during that peaking block. It's more at a maintenance level. And so that's great for displaying strength, but not good for building strength or building hypertrophy. So you want to conserve those for testing periods or for meet specifically. Oftentimes what I'll do is if I have an athlete who hasn't had a meet in a while, who's still in that intermediate phase, I'll often just do a strength block with singles on top of it. So it's not like a true test, but at least gives them some singles, let them work up to like an RP9, RP8, and then allow them to kind of test their numbers, see where they're at, and then we can reevaluate their training from there. And so you're going to rerun that basic macro cycle of hypertrophy, strength, peaking, until eventually when you become an advanced lifter, and that you'll notice that cycle no longer works, or parts of it you realize that the athlete doesn't respond to. And so now we're getting into that, what is very popular in powerlifting training right now, that sort of that emerging strategy style training that Mike Teixeira of RTS has popularized, where it's now we're becoming more advanced to where the number of things that get us stronger is getting smaller. So we need to now focus on, all right, what is the training that this athlete actually responds to? And we can actually start to see that because the information's actually emerging, right? We're getting to a point where we see less and less things work, so we need to really hammer down on what is actually working for the athlete. So this is where you're going to really need to fine-tune the formula of, all right, what specific ranges does this athlete benefit from? What type of variables do we need to adjust to keep this athlete progressing? And oftentimes when you're in this advanced stage, it's you have this formula, you have this microcycle, and you are more or less just repeating that over and over and over again with subtle variations from block to block. So like, let's say you have an athlete who responds better to higher repetitions, lower exertions, and just kind of tapers out or peters out more at like the higher intensities. So like, let's say their primary day is a top single, and then they respond well to higher repetitions. All right, well, you might rotate through a block of 9s, a block of 8s, and a block of 7s, right? The difference between 7, 8, and 9 reps isn't that great. Like, it's essentially the same thing, but you can kind of build in that progression there of, all right, well, we're doing your third block out for competition as 9s, and then 2 blocks out is 8, and then 1 block out is 7s, because that's the heaviest of that range that you respond to. So that's where, as an advanced athlete, you really need to start honing down on what specifically works for you. And at that point, if you're an advanced level athlete, like, you're dedicated, right? You're okay with doing essentially the same workout over and over and over and over again. There might be like strategic breaks to kind of conserve the strategy that works really well. Like you might have your off-season periods be like a change from the formula that works, just to give your body a break, so that when you go back to it, you know it's fresh and it's going to work. But for the most part, when you're an advanced athlete, it's very specific of what you need to do, and you just need to rinse and repeat that formula and kind of fine tune it over time. And so that's the major goal. That's where we get that hyper individualization that the advanced athlete needs, but that the beginner novice lifter doesn't, and maybe even the intermediate doesn't. Now, maybe you have a lifter who is a low responder to training, and even though they fall into the beginner category, they may need that more specific advanced periodization strategy to even get them to make progress. That's totally fine. It's more of, don't go to that really advanced strategy before you have to, because then you're missing all of this other work that can potentially benefit the athlete. And so you don't want to do more than you need to initially. You always want to do, not necessarily the minimum effective dose, right? But keep the training simple, and then only add complexity or the nicheness of it as needed. That's going to allow the athlete to stay as mentally engaged the most, as I've seen, where if you get too specific too quickly with a young athlete, they're just going to disengage and burn out because it's boring, right? So you need to understand that and kind of almost gamify the process of progressing the periodization model, of going from this linear progression of just adding weight to the bar, not really having a super specific strict structure, to more of this block periodization model where, hey, we're adding in some more structure to it, we're getting more specific, to we're in the advanced stages, we're using wave loading, we have a very specific formula that we're fine-tuning over and over again for the athlete, because they are at the top of their abilities, or they're at the top of their weight class, or top of rankings, right? That we need to hammer down at this, because this is the only thing that works for them. So that is how I kind of see the progression from a novice to intermediate to advanced lifter. As I said, it's not like set in stone, right? Depending on the athlete, when they're getting started or what their background is, they might fall into one of the categories earlier than you would expect, but that's generally how I would take an athlete from novice all the way to beginner to advanced. Let me know if this was useful. Let me know if you guys enjoyed this in the comment section. Let me know what you guys would like to see in the future. I have a whole list of videos that I'm excited to make, but this is sort of one that I think I've been really wanting to kind of flesh out. And so sitting here able to kind of talk this through was really fun and exciting. So I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.